In the spring of 1954, a pilot was driving home through Hamilton County, Ohio, when he looked up and stopped his car. He was not flying that night. He was just a man behind a wheel on an ordinary road, doing what you do at the end of an ordinary day. His name was John H. Stewart. He had enough hours in the air to know the difference between what belonged in the sky and what did not. And what he was looking at did not belong. Above the Cincinnati General Electric plant, hanging in the air with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be, was a dark oval object. It glowed blue, not the blue of an aircraft beacon or a reflection off clouds, something else. Something with its own light, its own stillness. Stewart watched it for 4 minutes. In aviation, 4 minutes is a long time to look at something you cannot identify. He watched it the way you watch a thing that has already decided it is not afraid of you. Then it moved. It turned east and it left. Not the way planes leave. Banking gradually, engines audible, navigation lights blinking in sequence. It accelerated in a way that Stewart, a man professionally trained to understand how objects move through air, could not account for. And then it was gone. Stewart filed a report. The report was documented in the CRIFO newsletter, April 1954, cross-referenced in the official catalog of sightings under case number 37. And then, like most of what happened over Ohio that year, it quietly disappeared into the machinery of official record-keeping, never to be formally resolved. He was not the only one. 2 months later, on a May evening in Dayton, a red object described in witness accounts as shaped like a dinner plate hung on its edge in the sky for 15 minutes. It didn't drift. It didn't flicker. It sat there, visible to anyone who happened to look up, and then it tilted. Witnesses disagreed on how exactly, only that its shape seemed to change. And it was gone. High speed, east, the same. Direction as the Cincinnati object. Documented in the CRIFO newsletter, June 1954. Filed with official investigators. No explanation issued. In June, over Cleveland, a different kind of object. Larger. Witnesses described it as blimp-shaped, roughly 80 feet long, moving at 300 feet of altitude, low enough that the shape was unmistakable. It flew. It stopped. It came back. And then a helicopter approached, and the object disappeared. Not landed, not ascended, just gone. The way things go when they don't want to be followed. Documented in the NICAP catalog, June 22, 1954, 3 sightings, 3 different cities, 3 different shapes, 3 different behaviors. The only things they shared were the state of Ohio, the year 1954, and the fact that none of them were ever officially explained. If you look at those 3 locations on a map, something becomes difficult to ignore. The GE plant in Cincinnati, the sky over Dayton, the airspace above Cleveland. Draw lines between them. Then look at what sits at the center of that triangle. 15 miles from the Dayton sighting, close enough that on a clear night you could see its runway lights from certain hilltops, sat Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And inside Wright-Patterson, in offices whose existence was not publicly confirmed, operated a unit called Project Blue Book, the official United States Air Force program for the investigation and classification of unidentified flying objects. Think about what that means for a moment. The objects were appearing in the backyard of the only organization in the country whose official job was to explain objects away. They were appearing above defense-adjacent industrial facilities in a corridor of airspace that Project Blue Book personnel drove through on their way to work. And the people who saw them, the pilots, the factory workers, the families who stepped outside on summer evenings and looked up, were filing their reports not with their local police departments, not with their newspapers, not with anyone they knew. They were filing them somewhere else, with someone whose name, in 1954, almost nobody outside a very small circle had heard of. Here is the part that the official history of this period tends to glide past. The neighbors who saw what happened over Ohio that year didn't call the newspapers. They didn't call their friends. They didn't organize town halls or petition their congressman. They called a man on the other side of Cincinnati, a private citizen, a man with a day job, a man who published a mimeographed newsletter out of his house in the suburb of Mariemont. and mailed it to subscribers for 25 cents an issue. And by September of 1955, that same man, the one with the newsletter, the one collecting the reports, the one quietly building what would become the largest civilian UFO research network in the world, had been secretly contacted by the United States Air Defense Command. He had been given access to the Ground Observer Corps, a network originally established to spot incoming Soviet bombers. He had been given a telephone code, a specific sequence of words and numbers he was to use when calling the ADC, with reports that, in his assessment, warranted immediate attention. He had been told with unmistakable clarity not to ask questions about what happened to those reports after he called them in. A private citizen, a newsletter publisher, running what was, in all but name, an intelligence node for the Air Defense Command. A node that the Air Defense Command would later deny had ever existed, while simultaneously thanking him in writing, on official letterhead, signed by a major general. His name and what he knew is where this story gets dangerous. But before we get to him, we need to understand what was already happening in Washington 12 months before John H. Stewart stopped his car in Hamilton County, because the silence, the specific legal, documented federally enforced silence that would eventually surround what people saw over Ohio in 1954 did not happen by accident. It did not happen because witnesses were shy or forgetful or unsure of themselves. It happened because someone built it, deliberately, with a budget, a classified report, and a set of recommendations so precisely engineered that their effects are still echoing 70 years later. The neighbors weren't warned to stay quiet by a man in a black car. They were prohibited from talking by a federal statute passed in December 1953 that made unauthorized disclosure of a UFO citing a crime under the Espionage Act, punishable by up to 10 years in prison, and the document that recommended that statute, the document that built the machinery of silence that descended over places like Hamilton County and Dayton and Cleveland in 1954, was classified for more than 20 years after it was written. We know what it says now. And what it says is remarkable. His name was Leonard Stringfield, and he was not the kind of man you would expect to find at the center of this story. He was not a soldier, not a scientist, not a government official with a clearance and an agenda. He was a public relations executive for a petroleum company in Mariemont, Ohio, a quiet suburb of Cincinnati, the kind of place where people mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and know their neighbors by first name. He drove to work. He came home. He had a house, a family, a telephone, and a filing system. He was, by every external measure, an ordinary man living an ordinary post-war American life. Except that he had seen something over Iwo Jima in 1945 that he could not explain, and he had spent the 9 years since trying to find a framework that could hold what he had witnessed. August 28, 1945, 3 days before the formal end of World War II. Stringfield was an Army Air Force intelligence officer aboard a C-46 transport with 12 other specialists, approaching Iwo Jima at 10,000 feet in a sunlit sky. He was looking out the starboard window when he saw them. 3 objects, teardrop-shaped, brilliantly white, he would later write, like burning magnesium. They were flying on a parallel course to the transport, closing in, and they were not any aircraft he had been trained to recognize. Then the C-46's left engine feathered without warning. The magnetic navigation instruments went wild. The pilot sounded a ditch alert. Crew and passengers were told to prepare for impact with the Pacific Ocean. Stringfield looked out one last time before what he expected to be the final moments of his life, and saw the 3 objects climbing, approximately 20 degrees above the level of the transport until they faded into a cloud bank. The engine revved back up. The plane steadied. They landed safely at Iwo Jima. He never forgot what the instruments did when those objects were close. The needles going wild was not incidental detail. It was the part that stayed with him, technically, professionally. The part that told him whatever those objects were, they were doing something to the aircraft's magnetic environment. That was not a weather balloon. That was not swamp gas. He knew the difference. He had been trained to know the difference. So in March 1954, 9 years later, surrounded by the accumulating reports of things appearing in the Ohio sky, Leonard Stringfield did what a public relations professional does. He organized, he published, he built a network. He called the organization CRIFO, Civilian Research Interplanetary Flying Objects. Its newsletter was called Orbit. The first issue went out in April 1954, priced at 25 cents, mimeographed and mailed to anyone who wanted it. Within a year, 2,500 paid subscribers. By the mid-1950s, CRIFO had become the largest civilian UFO research organization in the world. Run from a house in a Cincinnati suburb by a man whose day job was writing promotional copy for petroleum products. But what made CRIFO genuinely unusual was not its size. It was who was sending Stringfield their reports, not just curious civilians, not just the cranks and the dreamers that official agencies were so quick to invoke whenever the subject came up. Stringfield was receiving accounts from police officers, from clergy, from trained military personnel who filed under anonymity, because they knew what happened to people in uniform who put their names on reports like these. His network extended across southwestern Ohio in a web of observers who trusted him precisely because he was not part of the official machinery. He was not going to bury their accounts. He was going to document them. He was, in other words, building exactly the kind of reporting infrastructure that the United States Air Defense Command would eventually realize it needed. September 9th, 1955. The phone rings at Stringfield's home in Marymount. The caller identifies himself as being from the Air Defense Command in Columbus, Ohio. The ADC, Stringfield is told, has been watching his network. They have a proposal. The Ground Observer Corps, a civilian program established during the early Cold War to give the military additional eyes on the sky, originally focused on spotting incoming Soviet bombers, was operating across southwestern Ohio. Its volunteers were already watching. The ADC wanted Stringfield to be the intermediary. GOC members in the region would be instructed to route their UFO sighting reports directly to him. He would screen them. The ones that warranted immediate attention, he was to call in. He was given a code, not a casual nickname, a formal designator, the kind of alphanumeric sequence that military communication systems run on. Foxtrot Kilo 30 Blue. That was the string he was to use when calling the ADC with a priority report. His telephone line, in the language of the Air Defense Command, was now designated a civilian UFO reporting post, the first of its kind in the country. He was told one rule, stated plainly, do not ask questions. He agreed. What Stringfield did not know at the time, what he would only piece together gradually, through fragments offered by people inside the system who trusted him enough to share what they weren't supposed to share, was what happened after he called the code in. A GOC member speaking to him informally explained the sequence. When Stringfield's screened report came in, it was evaluated against radar data. If the radar confirmed the sighting, if there was a return that matched what observers on the ground were describing, jets were scrambled. Interceptors were sent up. And the moment that happened, the case entered a different classification tier entirely. It became a military matter. The file left whatever civilian channel it had traveled through and entered a system that Stringfield had no access to and would never be allowed to see. He filed the report. The jets went to an up. He never heard what they found. He had been made, without ceremony or contract, into a node in an intelligence network. His subscribers were feeding him reports. He was screening them for significance. The significant ones he was calling in using a military code, and everything that happened after that call, every classified outcome, every scrambled intercept, every file that dropped into the Air Force's restricted UFO infrastructure, was kept entirely beyond his reach. Not ask questions. That was the rule. He had agreed to it. He kept it. He tried at least once to surface the arrangement. He went to the Cincinnati newspapers with the story, the ADC connection, the code, the screening function, the way the GOC had been quietly redirected to run sighting reports through a civilian publisher's living room. It was, by any reasonable measure, a remarkable story. A public relations man deputized as an intelligence asset, a suburban phone number functioning as a classified reporting channel. The newspapers were not interested. More precisely, the story was officially denied. The Air Defense Command, when asked, stated that no such arrangement existed. Stringfield's role was not confirmed. His connection to the ADC was not acknowledged. He went back to his filing system. In 1956, a letter arrived at his house in Mariemont. It was on official letterhead. It was signed by Major General John A. Samford, Director of Air Force Intelligence. The letter expressed formal appreciation for Stringfield's assistance and acknowledged the value of the civilian reporting network he had built in augmenting the Air Force's official investigation program. A letter of thanks for the program that didn't exist, signed by the Director of Air Force Intelligence, sent to the house where the program had been run, by the man the program had officially never involved. He kept the letter. He kept everything. What Stringfield didn't fully understand yet, what almost no civilian in 1954 or 1955 fully understood, was that the silence around what he was processing wasn't simply institutional caution. It wasn't the ordinary bureaucratic reflex of an agency protecting its methods. It had been deliberately designed, engineered with specificity, tested against legal frameworks and public communication strategies, and the particular psychology of a Cold War population that needed to be managed carefully. 1 year before the Ohio wave peaked, 1 year before John H. Stewart stopped his car in Hamilton County, 1 year before the Cryophone newsletter started landing in mailboxes across the Midwest, in a classified room in Washington, a panel of CIA scientists had convened to decide exactly what the American public was and was not going to be allowed to know about what was appearing in the sky above them. And they had chosen their mechanism of silence very carefully. January 1953, 14 months before John H. Stewart stopped his car in Hamilton County. 16 months before the red dinner plate object hangs over Dayton. 20 months before Leonard Stringfield's telephone became a classified reporting channel with a military code name. In a room in Washington that very few people knew existed, 5 scientists sat down to decide what America was going to be told about its own sky. Their chairman was Howard P. Robertson, a physicist, a CIA consultant, and the director of the Defense Department's Weapons Evaluation Group. He was not a man given to speculation or sentiment. He was a man given to conclusions. The CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence had asked him to convene a panel, review the Air Force's UFO files, and produce a recommendation on what to do about the growing public fascination with unidentified aerial objects. He had assembled 4 colleagues, physicists, astronomers, military scientists, men who had contributed to classified programs during and after the Second World War, men who understood professionally the difference between what the public needed to know and what the public needed to believe. The panel met for 5 days, January 14th through January 18th, 1953. Their proceedings were classified secret, the document that recorded everything they said and decided, written by CIA officer Frederick Durant, who served as the panel's secretary and known thereafter as the Durant Report, would not be released to the public for more than 20 years. What they decided in those 5 days shaped what you were and were not allowed to discuss in Ohio in 1954. In most of America for the next 2 decades, the first thing to understand about the Robertson panel is the scope of their review. The Air Force had been collecting UFO reports since 1947. By January 1953, those files contained thousands of accounts, from military pilots, commercial airline crews, radar operators, weather observers, and ordinary civilians across the continental United States. The Battelle Memorial Institute, a research organization in Columbus, Ohio, had been commissioned to conduct a systematic scientific analysis of those reports and was still working through them. Thousands of cases, years of data. The Robertson panel reviewed approximately 23 of them. 23 cases selected from thousands, examined over 5 days without field work, without site visits, without interviews of a single witness. The panel did not travel to Ohio or New Mexico or Washington or any of the locations where significant sightings had been logged. They sat in a room in Washington and read summaries, and at the end of 5 days they produced a conclusion. Their conclusion was this: the objects themselves were probably not a threat to national security. Most sightings could be explained as misidentifications of known phenomena. The remainder could, in all likelihood, be explained the same way with further study. But, and this is the part that determined everything that followed, public interest in the objects was a problem, a serious one. Not because citizens were wrong to report what they saw, but because the volume of reports threatened to overwhelm military communication channels at a moment when those channels needed to stay clear for actual Soviet threats. Because mass fascination with unidentified objects created psychological vulnerability that an enemy could exploit. Because the aura of mystery, as the panel put it, that had gathered around the subject was itself a kind of contagion, spreading through the population in ways that were unpredictable and, from a national security standpoint, dangerous. The solution was not transparency. The solution was education. Specifically, the panel recommended a coordinated national campaign to, in their own documented word, debunk UFO reports, strip them of their mystery, reduce public interest systematically using the mechanisms of mass communication that post-war America had perfected. They named their preferred delivery systems, the mass media, advertising, business clubs, schools, and specified by name in the Durant Report, Walt Disney Animated Cartoons. Walt Disney, the man whose studio had spent the war years producing government information films, whose animated characters had the demonstrated ability to reach a population and reshape its beliefs through entertainment. The Robertson panel recommended him by name as a vehicle for convincing the American public that what people were seeing in the sky was nothing worth worrying about. One panel member later wrote a letter to another confirming that he had personally helped organize a CBS television program structured around the panel's conclusions, not a documentary examining the evidence. A program built to deliver the verdict the panel had already reached through a medium that millions of Americans trusted as a source of information. This is not inference. This is in the record. The recommendations did not stop at television programming and cartoon campaigns. In August 1953, the Air Force issued Air Force Regulation 200-2. Under this regulation, all UFO sighting reports submitted to the Air Force became classified material. Release of information about any sighting was prohibited unless the sighting could be positively identified, meaning that the only cases the public would ever hear about officially were the ones that had already been explained away. The unresolved ones, the ones that remained genuinely unknown, were classified by definition. You could not discuss them. You could not report them. You could not confirm they existed. In December 1953, the Joint Chiefs of Staff promulgated JANAP 146, Joint Army-Navy Air Force Publication 146, subtitled Canadian-United States Communications Instructions for Vital Intelligence Sightings. This document established that reporting an unidentified flying object through unofficial channels, telling a newspaper, telling a neighbor, saying anything publicly about what you had seen was a crime. Not a policy violation, not a breach of etiquette, a crime. Under the Espionage Act, punishable by 1 to 10 years in federal prison or a fine of $10,000. The publication was binding on military personnel. It was binding on commercial airline pilots. It was binding on anyone who had been informed of its existence, which meant that the act of being told about the law extended the law's reach. Knowledge of JANAP 146 was itself a kind of conscription into its silence. In 1958, a revision to Air Force Regulation 200-2 added a further mechanism. Under the revised regulation, the military was authorized to provide the FBI with the names of individuals who were, in the regulation's language, illegally or deceptively bringing the subject to public attention. People who talked about what they had seen were not simply risking prosecution. They were risking having their names forwarded to the Federal Bureau of Investigation as potential security threats. The machinery had been built with care, with layered redundancy, with the kind of precision that institutional engineers apply to problems they intend to solve permanently. I want to pause here, because this is the moment where this story stops being about strange lights in the Ohio sky and becomes about something harder to look at directly. Everything described in the preceding paragraphs is documented. The Durant Report is declassified. JANAP 146 is declassified. Air Force Regulation 200-2 is declassified. The Robertson panel's membership, their deliberations, their recommendations, their suggested use of Walt Disney as a vehicle for public belief management. All of it is in the public record, available at the National Archives, on microfilm, and in digitized collections that anyone with an internet connection can access today. This is not a theory assembled from fragments and inference. It is a documented institutional program created by identified people in identified positions, implementing identified policies through identified legal mechanisms in identified calendar years. The panel met in January 1953. The regulations followed in August and December of the same year. The Ohio sightings peaked in 1954. Stringfield's network was absorbed into the Air Defense Command in 1955. The sequence is not ambiguous. Here is the hinge on which this entire story turns. The neighbors who looked up over Hamilton County, over Dayton, over Cleveland, over the industrial corridors of southwestern Ohio in 1954. The ones who saw something they could not explain and felt the instinct that every honest observer feels, the instinct to tell someone. Those neighbors were not silenced by rumor or social pressure or the vague sense that nobody would believe them. They were silenced by a federal regulation, a classified publication, a criminal statute passed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff 8 months before most of them saw anything at all. They were not sworn to silence by a man in a black car at the end of their driveway. They were sworn to silence by a machinery of institutional prohibition that had been engineered with documented precision in Washington by a CIA physicist and 4 colleagues who spent 5 days in January 1953 reviewing 23 files and deciding what a nation of 200 million people was going to be permitted to believe about its own sky. The question that follows from that, the one this story has been building towards since the moment John H. Stewart stopped his car, is what exactly it was that required that level of machinery to contain. If the objects were nothing, the regulation was unnecessary. If the regulation was necessary, the objects were not nothing. At this point in the story, I want to slow down, because everything that has been laid out so far, the 1954 Ohio sightings, the secret civilian network, the classified regulations, the Robertson panel's documented recommendations, has a shape that can start to feel, if you are a careful and skeptical person, like a narrative, like a case being built toward a predetermined conclusion. And I think you deserve better than that. So this chapter is going to do something different. It is going to put the primary sources in front of you and let them speak without much interpretation, not what researchers claimed happened, not what witnesses believe they saw, what the documents say, what the official records show, what the government's own scientists found in the government's own study using the government's own data. You can verify every item in this chapter yourself. The sources are named. Most are digitized. Several are held at the National Archives in Washington on 94 rolls of 35mm microfilm designated T-1206, available to any member of the public who walks through the door and asks for them. Start with the Norwood Searchlight case, because it is the one the official explanation most visibly strains against. The sightings began in August 1949 in Norwood, Ohio, a small city embedded in the north side of Cincinnati, close enough that its residents could see the Cincinnati skyline on clear nights. An Army sergeant named Donald R. Berger was operating a powerful searchlight at a carnival event when he caught something in the beam that he could not explain. He was trained in the identification of aircraft. He had the kind of professional relationship with the sky that comes from military service. What he saw was not an aircraft. He kept logs. This is the first thing worth noting about Berger. He was a man who wrote things down. Dates, times, durations, weather conditions, precise descriptions of what the beam illuminated and what the object did when it was illuminated. His logs from 1949 were kept in the possession of a Reverend Gregory Miller until 1954, when Miller passed them to Leonard Stringfield for documentation and preservation. The logs contain a sentence that is difficult to explain away with standard atmospheric optics. Berger wrote, "When I moved the searchlight away, the object continued to glow." A searchlight reflection does not continue to glow when the searchlight moves away. That is definitionally impossible. A reflection requires a source. Remove the source, the reflection disappears. What Berger was describing was an object with its own luminosity, something that absorbed the beam or generated its own light independently of it. Over the following 7 months, the sightings recurred. 10 documented observations in total. The witnesses across those 10 events included civilians, clergy, police officers, and Berger himself, who continued to track the object with his searchlight on multiple separate occasions. Film was taken. Still frames from that film were given to Stringfield, published in his book Inside Saucer Post 3-0 Blue, and subsequently analyzed by Dr. Richard Haynes, a research scientist who spent years at NASA's Ames Research Center studying pilot UFO reports. The official explanation issued for the Norwood sightings was that observers had been watching searchlight beams bouncing off clouds. A Weather Bureau official who examined the case offered a variation. The objects resembled 2 weather sealing balloons, he said, stationary ones. The wind speed that night was recorded at 25 to 32 miles per hour. Weather balloons do not remain stationary in 32-mile-per-hour winds. Clouds that reflect searchlight beams do not continue to glow after the searchlight moves away. These are not matters of interpretation. They are matters of basic physics, and the official explanation contradicts both of them. The explanation was issued anyway. The case was closed. Now set the Norwood case alongside the others from 1954 that we have already covered, and look at what the pattern produces. March 9th, 1954. John H. Stewart, a pilot, observes a dark oval object with a blue glow hovering above the Cincinnati GE plant in Hamilton County for 4 minutes before it accelerates east at high speed. Documented in the CREFO newsletter, April 1954, cross-referenced in the Thomas Olson reference catalog as case number 37, entered in the Project Blue book filing system. May 12, 1954. A red object shaped like a dinner plate, observed hanging on its edge over Dayton, Ohio for 15 minutes before changing shape and departing at speed. Documented in the CREFO newsletter, June 1954, June 22nd, 1954. An object estimated at 80 feet in length, described as blimp-shaped, observed over Cleveland at approximately 300 feet of altitude. It hovered. It flew away. It returned. When a helicopter approached, it disappeared. Documented in the NICAP catalog, 1954, UFO cat entry, 3 cities, 3 months. 3 objects with different shapes, different behaviors, different witnesses, and a shared characteristic that only becomes visible when you look at them together. None of them were explained. All of them were filed. And all of the files entered a classification system that, under Air Force Regulation 200-2 issued the previous August, prohibited their contents from being released to the public unless the sighting had been positively identified. None of them were positively identified, which means none of their files were released, which means under the regulatory framework then in force, their existence was classified by default. Now look at what Project Blue Book's own aggregate record shows, because this is where the official story begins to contradict itself in ways that are arithmetically hard to ignore. From 1947 to 1969, Project Blue Book investigated 12,618 reported sightings. That number is not contested. It is the air. Force's own figure, stated in their own fact sheet, repeated in every official summary of the program's history. Of those 12,618 cases, 701 remain categorized as officially unidentified, not explained by later research, not resolved by declassified information, officially unidentified by the agency whose stated purpose was to identify them to this day. The year 1952 produced 303 unexplained sightings on its own, more than all other years of the program combined. The scale of that single-year anomaly has never been fully accounted for in the official record. But the number that matters most for understanding what the official record actually shows came not from Project Blue Book itself, but from the organization commissioned to analyze it scientifically, the Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio, the same Columbus that housed the Air Defense Command Office that would later telephone Leonard Stringfield, was contracted by the Air Force to conduct the largest statistical analysis of UFO reports ever undertaken. Over several years, Battelle's scientists encoded approximately 3,200 cases onto IBM punch cards, applying standardized criteria across 30 separate report characteristics, analyzing the data with the most sophisticated computational tools available in the early 1950s. Their study was completed in 1954. It is known as Blue Book Special Report Number 14. What Battelle's statisticians found, in their own data using their own methodology, presented in their own report across 240 charts, tables, graphs, and maps, was a statistically significant difference between the cases that could be explained and the cases categorized as unknown. The unknowns were not distributed randomly across the data set the way misidentifications would be expected to distribute. They clustered. They shared characteristics. They behaved, statistically, like a distinct category of phenomenon rather than like a residue of human error and atmospheric confusion. The published conclusions of Blue Book Special Report Number 14 contradicted this finding. The document that presented 240 charts demonstrating a meaningful distinction between explained and unexplained cases concluded in its summary language that UFOs were not a significant phenomenon warranting further study. Researchers who have examined both the data and the conclusions have noted consistently that the two are in direct tension. The analysts appear to have had difficulty, as one assessment put it, accepting their own results. That assessment was published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. You can read it yourself. There is one more entry in the official record that belongs in this chapter because it reframes everything that came before it. In 2014, the CIA declassified a history of the U-2 spy plane program. Buried in that history was a disclosure that had been withheld for 60 years. Blue Book investigators, the document states, regularly contacted CIA analysts to cross-reference reported UFO sightings against U-2 flight logs. The CIA already knew what some of the objects were. They were American spy planes flying at altitudes commercial aviation had never reached, their silver wings catching sunlight at angles that made them visible from the ground in ways that looked like nothing any observer had a framework to identify. The CIA knew, Blue Book knew, and neither told the witnesses, the press, or the public, because disclosing that a secret aircraft was operating in that airspace would have been a greater security breach than leaving the sightings unexplained, which means some of the 701 officially unidentified cases were cases where the government knew the answer and chose, for documented national security reasons, to leave the file open, which means the 701 is not a ceiling on what was genuinely anomalous. It is a floor. Here is what makes Ohio specifically matter and why this is not simply a general survey of a strange era in American aviation history. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the physical headquarters of Project Blue Book, the building where the files lived, the offices where the investigators worked, the base where the classified material was stored, was 15 miles from the Dayton sighting. It was 90 miles from the Cleveland sighting. It was in the same metropolitan corridor as the Cincinnati sightings, the Norwood sightings, and the house in Marymount where Leonard Stringfield was operating a classified reporting channel on behalf of the Air Defense Command. The objects were appearing in several documented cases directly over defense-adjacent industrial facilities, the GE plant in Cincinnati, the airspace above a major industrial city, the corridors that connected them, and the man that the United States Air Defense Command selected to quietly screen those reports, to act as their unofficial civilian intelligence node, to use the code Foxtrot Kilo 30 Blue when calling in. Priority cases. That man lived in Cincinnati, 15 miles from the base, inside the cluster. This is not an argument. It is a geography. The geography is in the record. What happens to Stringfield when the program ends? And what he spends the last decades of his life trying to say about what he learned while running it, is where this story arrives at its final and most uncomfortable destination. In 1957, Leonard Stringfield shut CRIFO down. He did not announce it dramatically. He did not publish a final issue of Orbit explaining what had changed or why he was stepping back. He simply stopped. The newsletter ended. The organization dissolved. The man who had built the world's largest civilian UFO research network from a suburban Cincinnati house went back to his full-time job writing promotional copy for Dubois Chemicals, a division of Chemed Corporation, and the machinery that had briefly made him one of the most important nodes in the Air Defense Command's informal intelligence network quietly ceased to exist. The timing was not coincidental. That same year, 1957, the Air Defense Command disbanded the Ground Observer Corps entirely, the civilian program that had been routing UFO reports through Stringfield's living room. The network of volunteer sky watchers who had been quietly redirected from spotting Soviet bombers to calling a public relations man in Mariemont with coded priority reports was dissolved. The GOC's function was absorbed into radar systems that didn't need human observers anymore. The arrangement that officially had never existed ended in the same official silence in which it had operated. Stringfield was thanked. He had already received a letter from Major General Samford. He received acknowledgement, in the careful language of institutions that are closing a chapter, that his contributions had been valuable. And then he was made invisible, not threatened, not surveilled as far as he knew, simply returned to the category of private citizen, as though the previous 3 years, the code name, the screened reports, the scrambled jets, the classified outcomes he was never permitted to learn, had been a temporary loan of significance that the government had now called back. He had been useful. The usefulness had ended. The record of the arrangement was denied. He went back to the chemicals company. He kept the files. This is the thing about Leonard Stringfield that the official history of the UFO era consistently underweights. He kept everything. The sighting reports filed by anonymous police officers, the accounts from military personnel who trusted him enough to put their observations on paper knowing that doing so under their own names could end their careers, the letters, the photographs, the film stills, the correspondence with Air Force officers who wrote things to him privately that they would never have said on the record. 60 volumes, accumulated over decades, stored in a house in Cincinnati by a man whose institutional memory of what had happened over Ohio in the 1950s was more complete than any official archive, because the official archive had been specifically designed not to preserve it. For 20 years after CRIFO ended, Stringfield continued his research privately. He went deeper, following a thread he had first encountered through the anonymous accounts flowing into his network. Accounts not just of sightings, but of something more difficult. Accounts from people who claim to have direct knowledge of retrieved objects, of materials recovered from incidents that never appeared in any public record, of bodies. Most of those accounts, he noted carefully, centered on activities at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He collected them with the same methodical discipline he had brought to everything else. He documented sources. He noted corroborating details. He cross-referenced accounts from witnesses who had no knowledge of each other, but whose descriptions aligned on specific technical particulars. He did not publish any of it for 20 years, not because he doubted what he had gathered, but because he understood, with the precision of a man who had once operated inside the classification system, exactly what the cost of publishing it might be. In 1978, he decided the cost was worth paying. He was invited to speak at the MUFON Symposium, the annual conference of the Mutual UFO Network, held that year in Dayton, Ohio. 40 miles from Wright-Patterson, he prepared a presentation called Retrievals of the Third Kind, a case study of alleged UFOs and occupants in military custody. His first public report on 20 years of quietly gathered testimony about what had been recovered, stored, and studied in facilities whose existence was not acknowledged. Before the conference, he received 2 death threats. He could not identify who sent them. He did not know if they were serious or theatrical, or the work of someone genuinely alarmed by what he was about to say, or simply meant to test whether fear would accomplish what official denial had not. He examined them. He thought about them. He gave the talk anyway. He stood in a room in Dayton, Ohio. in the shadow of the base he had spent decades circling, and said out loud what the regulatory framework of 1953 had been specifically designed to prevent anyone from saying. He named sources. He described patterns. He presented the architecture of testimony he had assembled, piece by piece, from people who had trusted him with things they were legally prohibited from disclosing. The applause, when he finished, was long. Over the next 16 years, until his death in December 1994, Stringfield self-published 7 status reports, privately printed, carefully documented updates to his crash retrieval research, mailed to a network of researchers and investigators who had come to regard him as the most serious archivist of classified testimony in the country. He received no institutional support. He sought none. He was a man with a filing system and a conscience, operating entirely outside the apparatus that had once given him a code name and then pretended he didn't exist. When he died, the 60 volumes went into private hands. In 2012, they were donated to MUFON. A state director who reviewed the collection said this: "In those 60 volumes, there is evidence of government interference, of the FBI and CIA moving to stop investigators, of named officials being briefed on things the public was never told." He did not say it breathlessly. He said it the way people say things they have read with their own eyes and are still processing. I keep returning to the ordinary witnesses, not Stringfield, who became in his own way a historical figure, whose name is in the record and whose work survived him. The others, the ones who never became figures of any kind. The factory worker in Hamilton County who looked up on an evening in 1954 and saw something above the GE plant that moved in a way that made no sense to him. The family in Dayton who watched a red object hang motionless over their city for 15 minutes. The people who stood in their backyards in Norwood, Ohio, on repeated evenings over 7 months, and watched an object hold its position in a 32-mile-per-hour wind and glow with its own light after the searchlight moved away. These people were not scientists. They were not investigators. They were residents of southwestern Ohio who had the ordinary human experience of seeing something they could not explain and feeling the ordinary human impulse to report it. They sent their accounts to a man with a newsletter and a mimeograph machine. Some of them filed formal reports that entered the official system. Many of them filed under anonymity because they understood or had been told or had intuited from the texture of official responses that putting their names on what they had seen carried a risk they were not prepared to take. Under JANAP 146, as it existed in 1954, that instinct was legally correct. Telling an unauthorized person what they had witnessed was a federal crime. The regulation did not distinguish between a military officer and a grandmother who had watched something cross her back field. It did not distinguish between a commercial pilot and a shift worker who had stopped his car on the way home from the GE plant. The statute was categorical. What you saw was classified by the act of seeing it, if it could not be officially explained. They did not call newspapers. They did not hold town halls. They called a phone number in Mariemont and gave whatever information they had, and then they waited, and eventually they stopped waiting, and they never heard anything back. They lived the rest of their lives with what they had seen in a country whose official position was that they had not seen it. There is a researcher, a serious one, with institutional affiliation and published work, who spent time in an archive some years ago going through Stringfield's original Orbit newsletters, the ones from 1954 and 1955, before the classification machinery fully descended, when the reports were still coming in, and he was still documenting them with the energy of a man who believed that if enough careful people paid careful attention, something true might eventually surface. The researcher read through the sighting reports, many of them transcribed in Stringfield's own handwriting. The names were sometimes redacted, the anonymity preserved even across decades. What remained were the observations themselves, precise, unadorned, written by people who were trying to describe something accurately and knew or suspected that accuracy was all they had to offer. The researcher sat with the newsletters for a while before putting them down. When asked later what the experience had been like, the answer was brief. He said, "Whatever those people saw, they saw something. You can tell the difference. in the quality of the language, between someone embellishing and someone reporting. These were reports. The Robertson panel recommended in its classified January 1953 report that the CIA monitor civilian UFO research groups because of their, and I am quoting the document directly, potentially great influence on mass thinking and their possible use for subversive purposes. Leonard Stringfield was not a subversive. He was a public relations executive who saw something over Iwo Jima in 1945 that changed the way he understood the sky, and who spent the rest of his life trying to document what other people were seeing in it. He was, for a period of several years, an officially deputized asset of the United States Air Defense Command, given a military code name and a classified reporting function, trusted enough to screen priority sighting reports for the agency responsible for defending American airspace. And the moment his network was no longer operationally useful to them, the entire arrangement was dissolved, officially denied, and removed from any public record that might confirm it had ever existed. The letter of thanks from the Director of Air Force Intelligence went into his private files, not into any file the public could access. His connection to the ADC was denied when he tried to discuss it with the press. The program he had run, the network he, Elmers, had built, the reports he had screened, none of it entered the official history of how America responded to the UFO phenomenon in the 1950s. The question I cannot stop sitting with is not a dramatic one. It does not require the acceptance of any particular conclusion about what the objects were, or where they came from, or what the government ultimately knew about them. It is simpler than that. If there was nothing to hide, what exactly did the regulation prohibit? If the sightings over Ohio in 1954 were weather balloons, and searchlight reflections and the ordinary errors of ordinary people misreading an ordinary sky, if the official explanation was accurate and complete, then JANAP 146 was a law that criminalized people for reporting nothing. The Robertson panel was a classified CIA operation convened to manage public interest in nothing. The letter of thanks from Major General Samford was gratitude for helping contain nothing. Regulations with prison sentences attached are not written to protect nothing. The neighbors knew. Some of them filed reports. Those reports are in the National Archives on 94 rolls of microfilm, available to anyone who walks through the door and asks for them. And they are still, officially, unidentified.